Hello, Steve.
Hello, Tom.
Hello in your camp here. Got your nice little campfire going from breakfast. Did you have a good breakfast this morning?
Bacon, egg, sausage,
Oh,
and
boy.
of course, coffee.
And got the coffee on
Coffee's
here.
always on.
Coffee's always on. What a welcoming sight.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Steve, I know you've got a wonderful display set up here. Would you mind walking us through here and
Sure.
just sharing with the viewers here a little bit?
Yeah, well, obviously we talked about the campfire, and that's where all the cooking took place. This is a fairly small, back in the Civil War days, there would have been a lot larger group that they would have been cooking for.
Right.
But for our group, this works fine. And so I've got some of the utensils that may have been used during the Civil War, some of the pans. One thing that is nice to cook with is cast iron, but think about the weight of cast iron.
The individual soldier could not carry it.
Absolutely.
But if they were traveling as a regiment and they had some wagons, why they could carry cookware like that.
And they would have typically been steel pots that would have stacked inside of each other. One is the wagon masters were a little particular about how much was going on their wagon. So if you can get a whole set of steel pots compared to a cast Dutch oven, you know what they were going to allow on board. But anyway, we like to cook with it nevertheless. And so just taking you around here, some of the stories that I like to tell is actually finding letters from soldiers.
Okay.
This particular one was Robert Lindsay, talks about would have been his last good breakfast right before the Battle of Shiloh. So he wrote his sister, described in very good detail that morning that he had and the wonderful breakfast he had. He was later captured in the Hornet's Nest.
Okay.
And that would have, and then ended up dying in a Georgia prison.
Wow.
So to find a letter like this that he would have written back to his sister that described his last breakfast.
In reading old Civil War letters, I concur. Whenever when they were hungry and been out on campaign for a long time and they came across a good food source, they would often include in their letter, oh, we had honey, we had apples, we had oranges.
Sweet potatoes.
And they'd just go on about their great fortune.
Yes.
And another thing in reading those letters, it doesn't matter if it was written in 1860 or 2024. I don't want to be here. I wish I was home, and the food sucks, right?
Yep.
The letters are pretty much the same.
Yeah. Yeah. But every once in a while,
every now and then,
that appreciation comes through, and those are just golden to find.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah.
So let's step on in here just a little ways.
So, and you were talking about some of the foraging that the soldiers might have done. Of course, in Iowa right now, everybody's got peppers and tomatoes. Down south, they would have found a lot of sweet potatoes and would have probably found other vegetables, cabbage that they would have foraged for to augment their food.
Right.
And so that was real important. Salt pork and hardtack gets a little old after a while. So finding some fresh vegetables that they would have foraged for was...
And if they were really fortunate, they had a herd. They were driving a herd along with them and maybe had some fresh beef.
Beef on the hoof, yes.
Yeah, beef on the hoof.
Yeah, that was a big deal.
I always like to read about whenever they'd go marching down a road and if the road was lined with apple trees or any kind of fruit trees.
Peaches.
Those bottom limbs were picked clear as they went marching by. They all grabbed one.
And wouldn't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so this is where I keep my food. I call this a mess chest. And basically, I just keep some of the basic ration information in it. But it was also based on the size of a 50-pound hardtack box.
Okay.
The hardtack box wouldn't have had the handles and hardware, just been nailed and strapped. But this would have held 50 pounds of hardtack. And so the ration for a soldier was a pound of hardtack per day. Start doing the math, 100 in a company and 1,000 in a regiment, and take it on up. How many boxes of hardtack had to be shipped? That had to be on the wagon trains.
Those a lot, a whole lot. Okay, so speaking of hardtack, and that's pretty interesting. I mean, that stuff lasted for years.
Yes, it did.
I understand there's still some around today that's still edible.
Well,
left over.
Yeah, that depends on how hungry you are, I think.
I think so, but it was an amazing food to
yes,
carry.
It was.
I just wanted to point out that there was a difference in the way the soldier ate when they were on campaign versus whether they were in a winter camp or not.
Yes.
Typically, the armies didn't fight during the winter time, so they might set up a tent or a big camp, and in that case, there would be a regimental cook that would do the cooking for the entire regiment. But when you were on campaign, you got daily rations. So what would they carry those rations in?
Yeah, they'd have a haversack like this.
like this here.
Mm-hmm.
So inside of this, and this is kind of a gummy, uh, tarry type substance put over it. I don't know exactly what that was, but it made it waterproof. And then inside here, they could carry, they'd get issued rations for 3 days. They'd put their food in here, and there's also usually a little room for some personal items like a pencil and paper, and
that'd have been it. Most of those would have been in their knapsack,
and
on
some
their
of those
back.
on their knapsack.
Yep,
so
absolutely.
primarily for food, though.
Yeah. And one of the things, Tom, I'll point out is they would get their meat ahead of time. They'd cook it, because once on the march, they may not have a chance to start a fire. So they'd get, say, a five-day march, 5 days of ration. They would cook that meat up ahead of time, and then later on, they would get a enamel bag, is what they called it, and they would put their meat in there just to help keep it a little fresher.
Right.
The other things the soldiers, being pretty clever, is you get 5 days of rations, and I can put 2 days of rations in my belly and carry that a lot easier than I can on my back. Well, imagine what day 4 and 5, I'm a hungry guy now.
Oh, yeah. But then again, you had to cook it up and eat it pretty soon, because if you're down in Louisiana, Mississippi, 100+ degree day, you can't be carrying raw meat around inside of that.
Yeah, they talk about how much they stunk.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, you could smell an army before you could see it. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else do we have as a setup here?
So
representation.
So this is like a cutaway view of an officer's tent.
Okay.
This is actually called a baker's tent. They did have them, but they weren't used a lot.
Sure.
But this also shows what if you take an officer's wall tent, cut it in half, and look in sideways, an officer slept a lot better and lived a lot better than the privates did.
Right.
And so they may have a cot, may have a writing desk to do their reports, might even have a fancy clock. And then, so for me, during the day, I'm pretty much a private, but at night, I sleep like an officer.
Yeah, there you go.
But the soldiers would have been sleeping on the ground, usually in a small tent.
Now, I just happened to notice this shirt here. My sweetheart Lulu made this for me, and she sent it to me. I'm not wearing the standard issue white muslin shirt, and you were allowed to wear whatever color shirts. There was no restriction on that. But I noticed you're wearing a red shirt. Why are you wearing a red shirt?
Yeah, so red was the color for the artillery, the three main branches of the Army. Red, which also had the cross cannons, was the artillery. The infantry would have been a light blue. They would have had a bugle on theirs, and then the cavalry would have had the cross sabers, and it was a gold color. So when you looked out, you could see by the color of the uniform what branch they were with.
And you would also wear a shell jacket like this with the red piping on it.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay. So as we move out here just a little bit, you've got a small display here, kind of the bread. Here's kind of some hardtack here, in case you're wondering what hardtack is. Hardtack is basically just flour and water. And
a little bit of salt.
A tiny bit of salt, and they would bake it for several hours at a low temperature and bake all the moisture out of it. So that's what made it so hard.
And it's, as per its name,
it is hard, yes.
Yeah. And so what they would do is they would take that, bust it up in their coffee to soften it up, and then they just drink that as a slurry.
Sure.
So it's kind of a portable flour. The other thing they might do is break it up and put it in their bacon grease or their salt pork grease, just to soften it up, because try to chew on that, especially if you consider the dental hygiene wasn't quite what it is today. And so molar busters was one of the names that they would call it.
That's right. Right. Well, there's an old joke. The soldiers were sitting around the breakfast fire, and one of them said, yeah, I bit into my hardtack this morning and I found something soft in there. And somebody said, what was it, a weevil? He says, no, I think it was a nail. So, yeah. Okay, and just to kind of round things up, you got a few little samples of some of the fixed ammunition,
so
the artillery rounds?
Yeah, so this was the kit that I put together just to help explain the different rounds that would have been used in the smoothbore cannons. And so shot, shell, case, and canister were the four main type that they would have used. Fixed ammunition, the advantage here is first you have just one unit. You don't have a bag of powder and a projectile. It's all put together with a small wooden block called a sabot. And so they would strap the projectile to the wooden block and then put the pre-measured bag of powder on the end of that. The other advantage that gave is this now goes down the barrel, pointing the same direction. That allowed them to make exploding ammunition.
Mm-hmm.
So this would have a hollow sphere and would have an explosive inside. And then they would take a fuse, depending on the length and distance they would pound that in there.
Mm-hmm.
As that shell exits the barrel, that flame comes around and licks that fuse and lights it. And so 4 or 5, whatever seconds later, then it would explode.
Okay.
So this was a solid.
Do you remember, was that like 62 or 63 when they came out with the?
I don't remember exactly.
Somewhere, they didn't have it at the beginning of the war.
Yes.
So it was a year or two into the war when they came out with
really
the
good, the better exploding
Yeah.
ammunition. And of course, then the big game changer for that was the rifled
Oh, sure.
guns, like the rifled muskets.
Yep.
Really increased the range and the accuracy.
Yep.
The last piece that was probably the most devastating to the troops was the canister round. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as grape shot.
Mm-hmm.
Grape shot was actually bigger, so canister was technically probably what they were shooting at the troops in the field. And this is like a big shotgun shell, depending on the ammunition or the cannon. This may have been filled with musket balls, or it may have been filled with large steel balls. And those are relatively
heavy.
Small compared to what they would have actually been firing.
Right.
So this would have had about 27 balls like this in there, and then they were packed in sawdust. As the cannoneers were firing these rounds, the troops would know, because that sawdust would give a more orange glow.
Mm-hmm.
So 500 to 300 yards in, as the troops are advancing against the artillery, when they started seeing that orange ball of flame coming out of the artillery, they knew they were getting canister rounds.
Right.
Very devastating.
So they did come out with the exploding rounds, but there was still a use for the solid shot. So say your enemy's 1,000 yards across the field in a grove of trees and a bunch of trees. You'd want to shoot your solid shot into those trees and try to hit the trees, break up the branches. Yep. Splinters flying through the air, trees falling on them.
Mm-hmm. And
you don't want your enemy to be relaxed, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that was a big part of it too. Is just the amount of casualties from the artillery was relatively low compared to other ways. Especially the musket was the biggest one. But the mortal effect is what they called it. Is just when you have something like that rolling through your camp or through your tree line, it's going to scare you. Yeah. And that was that mortal effect that they were after. Yep. Very effective.
So as they came out of the trees, you still might want to stay with the solid shot, because you could bounce it in front of them and you could just mow them down almost like a bowling ball going through bowling pins.
Yep, absolutely.
Just bounce it. So then when they're getting closer, and that's when you'd want to maybe move to your exploding round, and that was designed to explode maybe 10, 15 yards above their heads, right?
Yes.
And then it would just shower shrapnel down onto them.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So we've went through those 3 rounds. Now they're within 100 yards. It looks like your position's going to get overrun. What are you going to do?
Yeah. So they would have been firing probably a couple rounds of canister as they could. As they get in, they would actually fire especially if they was in peril, they would fire a double canister, where they would put the first round in, they'd rip the bag of powder off the second one and run it down as well and fire at the troops. So now you've got a lot more shot in the air.
Now it's a double barrel shotgun.
Yes, indeed. Yeah,
indeed.
Yes.
I can't even imagine what it would be like as an infantryman having to walk up trying to take that position and having shots like that fired at you.
Yeah.
I did have a relative killed at the Battle of Cold Harbor. He was... they were trying to take over a Confederate artillery position. So.
Yeah, and those were prized by the infantry.
Oh yeah.
If you could take over an artillery position, well, that was a big deal.
Oh, I'm sure.
And it was the same way with the artillery, as not to get captured, and so they would do everything they could to make sure that they kept their gun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in a last case, they would spike the cannon, which would take a hard nail, and drive it into the vent, so that or pack something in the end of it so that it actually ruined the barrel.
Take the wheels off, or
Do whatever you
blow the
can to
wheels off
disable
of it.
that so they're not turning around and firing on
Right.
your troops.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for
You're
taking
welcome.
the time this morning.
Yeah, good to talk to
And
you.
to all our viewers, please thank Steve down there in the comments below. Kevin, thank you so much for being behind the camera there. Say hi, Kevin.
Hi.
And what do we want to do, Kevin? We want
Have a delightful
to
day.
wish everyone to have a very delightful day.